next speaker will be Mr. Tim Vasko. He's a founder of Blockers. Tim is entrepreneur, speaker, professor, and a founder of the entrepreneurship faculty at University of Victoria, and under Canadian government-sponsored scientific R&D grant programs. Tim holds MBA as professor, conducted PhD level research, is certified through MIT and Oxford. He has been selected in the top 10 thought leaders by Entrepreneur Magazine, top lessons from top leaders in 2018. He's active in the Canadian Trade Accelerator Boston. Now let's welcome Mr. Tim Vasko.
Thank you. So I'm going to give my presentation in English. How many people out here have done trade between Canada or international trade and used contracts? How many? Okay. We all use contracts. How many people like to trust who's on the other side of the transaction that they're dealing with? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about trustonomics because as Yuval Noah said, trade cannot exist without trust. And trustonomics is really what blockchain is about. So let's talk about trust. Let's talk about blockchain. I want to get it down to really the basics of how we use this technology to improve international trade. And there are three things that we all need to know about. What is the trust? And trust represents the protocol layer. Protocol is the math. All that stuff you just heard about, which was fascinating if I could have understood all of it, is about the protocol layer, the way we program the trust into the blockchain. The next is the network layer, truth. In the network, that's where your data is stored. And what we do with blockchain is we distribute that so no one person has control or no one entity has control over the network or the data. And finally, the application layer, and that's what most of us see. That's where we all look at these all day long and we say, and I'll show you, this is our application. So my entire business is on the blockchain and everything I have right here is held in my hand, but it can be anywhere in the world, okay? So think of blockchain in that regard. Now, why did blockchain come about? How many people remember when the market crashed in 2008 and we had a global meltdown? So in 2008, we had this massive global meltdown, this massive failure of trust in the economy, and that same year, Satoshi Nakamoto wrote the white paper and Bitcoin emerged. But the question is Bitcoin truly the new global currency? How many people think Bitcoin is the new global currency? Not very many people. A few people do. Well, the true real new global currency is trust. And we can now create these tokens, we can create these contracts, and we can create these elements with trust embedded. And when we do that, we can create our global trade or our international trade or our national trade. And that's what blockchain is. So it's a fabric, it's a fundamental shift, it's a fundamental change. And what we're going to talk about is a little bit about how you apply it. Okay? So the questions we ask is how we can create trust with all of these different areas. Trusting our bankers, trusting our insurance, trusting our governments. We want to create, all of us do business and actually live our lives based on a contract, don't we? How many people in this room have a passport? Just about everybody has a passport. Isn't that a contract with your government? How many of us know who we are? Most of the time, I don't know who I am, but if you know who you are and your government knows who you are, you have a contract with the government. And then you get to do all those wonderful things like pay taxes and things like that that we love to do. So that's why trust matters. We know trust matters. We depend on it in our lives. We depend on those contracts we have in our lives. And what we're going to talk about now is how smart contracts solve some of the problems with these contracts we use every day. And this is what every business will need to do. Okay? So first of all, before I get there, let's talk a little bit about that identity we just represented. When we're in emerging worlds like even in China, in the rural areas, in India, Africa, all over the world, there are people who don't have identity. In fact, there are 1.1 billion people in the world who don't even have an identity with their government. So if I was in a room with those people, they wouldn't be able to hold their hand up. How many people watched the event in Thailand where the kids were trapped in the cave? Right? Globally, we watched that and we were amazed at these kids being rescued. But guess what? At the end of that, we found out they were stateless. They didn't have an identity. Right? That's a huge problem for international trade. As soon as we solve that problem, we add 1.1 billion people into the economic ecosystem. That's trustonomics. Now, in our countries, from Canada to China to the United States to Europe to everywhere, we now have these regulations, and we're worried about things like, where is my data? Is my identity going to be stolen? Like, these are the first world problems that we have. We have identities. Now we need to protect them. And in the United States, we had this big breach with Equifax where some 160 million records were stolen. And they didn't even have permission to gather our data. They just did it to give credit scores. So you have this fundamental error in the internet. The internet is really broken from what it's doing today. But there's a solution to that. It's blockchain, the underlying fabric of being able to protect the things that we do and create these trusts at the finite level, at the level of where we have contractual terms. B, global business. This is not a country-by-country thing anymore. This is a global trade, a global handshake, and a global way to transact business. And finally, the smart contract behind it. So think about this. There's $1 trillion so far invested in blockchain technology. How many people think it's going away? Nobody. And you're right, it's not going away. It's as fundamental as when the internet came out. In fact, I'm going to ask this. This is a little geeky. How many people know what an IP address is? Almost everybody. Hold your hands up so I can see. Okay? So almost everybody knows what an IP address is. That's what we've invented with blockchain. We've invented a new kind of global IP address. That's why it's so fundamental. Because when we create these hashes, we now create this dynamic way to, just like with a website, you can find what you're looking for by that IP address. Okay? Except that it gets more in depth with every contract, which means when I'm dealing between Canada, the United States, or France, or China, or Africa, or India, all places where we do business, with that one hash, I can know what my trade is. I can know what people are and all of the people involved in a transaction, and I can verify it. So now I have trust. Not only that, we can break it down into 4 different areas. So the blockchain, think of it like this. The blockchain has 4 areas where it allows you to create your contracts. You have public or private, and all of us that run businesses want to have private transactions, right? But we still need that level of trust in who we're dealing with. And then we have permissionless and permission. A public permissionless blockchain is where it all started. That's Bitcoin. Anybody can look at it. It's public. It's permissionless. You don't know who the people are on the other side, but anybody can look at it. In the public permission side, we have things like supply chain producers. But increasingly, for anybody who's doing business supplying products to a country, we're going to want to know where the sources of those products come from. We're going to want to know who the suppliers are and things like that. So when you look at your smart contracts, you're going to break it into these categories, these 4 categories, and that's what's going to control your trade. Now, when we start dealing with what we can do, we can create those trade contracts, we can update them, we can write them, and we can read them, but we cannot delete them. Okay? So all of this kind of comes around to the math behind it and what really created it. How many people are familiar with game theory? A few people are. The professor's familiar with game theory, so he definitely could explain this. But what Nash equilibrium said, and then more recently the Almonds Agreement said, people who have an equivalent information cannot agree to disagree. Okay? So I'm going to use an example of the trade war currently going on between China and the United States. Okay, let's talk about that. On Monday this week, $200 billion worth of Chinese goods were subject to tariffs in the United States. Now, the problem with that is, first of all, economically, it's hurting both countries. Secondly, it really isn't based on fact or fundamentals of, is there an imbalance of trade? It's based on hype and assumptions, right? We don't know, really, if there's a balance of trade or an imbalance of trade with the way our current economies run. So if people are acting rationally and they have the same information, we can answer those questions, and then we can solve them with things other than trade wars. So immutable trust equals consensus. And that's really what we're talking about with our smart contracts. So what do smart contracts do, and why do they matter? Right now, we have over 1 billion contracts signed every year, e-signed every year. And every financial transaction requires that it's 100% secured and accurate. So when we look at supply chain and we look at what we're doing in our international trade, we look at these elements. And if we can manage those elements specifically through our smart contracts, then we can execute every smart contract using a token. And that's what the BlockCerts blockchain does, is it takes all of your contracts, all of your elements, allows you to immediately put them into a token and carry that token from authentication to the transaction that actually happens and records that in a distributed ledger and finally stores that information forever. Now, there's a lot of implications we don't have time to go into, but the reality is that you can now create this smart contract that says who's ultimately responsible for every contract provision, what's the status real time, moment by moment, and if there's a challenge or a change, it's on the blockchain and we can deal with it right away. That's what a smart contract does. So it's trust in the terms, truth in the performance, and transparency between all parties. Now we've got more efficient international trade. So what we don't need anymore are things like letters of credit. How many people have used a letter of credit to secure payment? We don't need that anymore. It's embedded in the contract. So you're dealing with terms, payments, and release of payments at the exact point that you need to do it. So truth, trust, transparency in every single transaction, we call that transaction streaming. The problem with current blockchains that we have is mining transactions are generally done through computers and they slow things down. When we do these smart contracts on the BlockCerts blockchain, every transaction mines itself. So you can control volatility, and the professor spoke a bit about volatility. You can control speed of transaction. You can control terms. And that's what you need to do when you're dealing with a smart contract. So I'm going to skip through some of these because I'm running out of time. But one of the big projects we have working right now is in the supply chain of food. And 69% of all food goes to waste because it's stored and manipulated for price. We have 70% of all food, or 1/3 of the world's food supply, is produced by smallhold farmers. And yet, those smallhold farmers, 60% of them live in poverty. And that's unnecessary. It's because of inefficiency in the supply chain, and it's mainly because of the middlemen that are in there controlling the food supply. These are all the brands. There's about 10 major corporations globally that control all the food worldwide, and these companies ask us to trust them. So what we basically have now is we have this ability to create these smart contracts on the fly very, very quickly, just as easily as you do a PDF. We have the ability to put programming language behind them. We have the ability to put payments in them. We have the ability to put micro terms in them, and we have the ability to see this real time, just like we see the news. That's what a smart contract is, and really that's what was intended, which is why I chose this quote, because we're just exploring this, but this fundamentally is nothing new. This fundamentally is where business began. It's how international trade began, and it's how we can continue to bring economic prosperity forward and avoid trade wars and the things that are going on today. Thank you very much.